Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Madam Minister. Thank you for all your staff for being here. Lots of ground to cover. I'm going to start with the climate leadership plan. It's been roughly 2 years, maybe a little more, since the climate leadership plan was originally introduced. What lessons have you learned in that time? Was there anything you would do differently if you were to be able to jump in your time machine and go back a couple of years? Is there anything you'd do differently in how you've implemented this plan?
Honourable Member, I think it's fairly hard to provide an analysis on that, given that in many ways we were building the airplane while flying it. But I will say that I'm very pleased with the progress report, and I'm very pleased with both the provincial and the federal Auditor General's assessment of the climate plan so far. If there's one thing that I am particularly proud of is that our system of output-based allocations has been essentially adopted by the federal government within the pan-Canadian framework. And that means that Alberta is setting the pace for how we price carbon for large final emitters and how industrial policy decisions and capital investment decisions are made over the next 20 or 30 years, not just in Alberta, but elsewhere. If there's one thing that I think that I'm sad that we haven't gotten to yet, it's the adaptation framework, and we're getting there. It is a remaining outstanding piece of work, and I know there's a really nice opportunity to engage with rural municipalities, with municipalities of all sizes, with communities. With citizen groups, with civil society, to really grapple with the big challenges of climate adaptation. I don't know if given resources we could have moved that quicker, and I'm glad that we're doing it in 2018, but I think it's an important and significant piece of public policy work that affects us all.
Good. Thank you. I appreciate that answer, and we'll definitely get to the adaptation piece. That's something I'm quite interested in as well. Look, one of the concerns I have, and I mean to be very clear, the Alberta Party and me certainly as a member, and just as a citizen person in the world, believe very much that climate change is one of the essential challenges of our time, and it's something we need to grapple with, and we do need policies that are thoughtful and appropriate to achieve the outcomes that we're striving for in terms of reducing carbon emissions. One of the concerns I have, and some of the feedback that I've heard, even from people who genuinely do care about reducing carbon emissions and addressing climate change, is some of the aspects of this plan breed questions, I guess. And one of those is the way the rebates, the scale of the rebates in the climate leadership plan. And is that something you've given, and to be very clear, where carbon levy, carbon tax, call it what you will, has a real impact on someone's ability to put food on the table, absolutely that should be offset through rebates. But I have a difficult time believing that 2/3 of households fall into that category. Have you given any thought at all to making that rebate somewhat more focused, as opposed to being quite so broad?
We chose the 2/3, or roughly 65–66% of Albertans to receive the rebate based on a couple of things. One was the experience that we saw in the province of British Columbia, who of course have had an economy-wide price on carbon since 2008, and a large way of part of the way that they redistribute those funds is essentially based on a more generous rebate for about 2/3 of British Columbians, and so that we had that analysis in place. Additionally, Dr. Leach undertook analysis as part of the CLP and recommended 60. We were in the middle of a recession, Honourable Member, and we know how much Alberta families were suffering at that time, even middle-income families. And there was a lot of instability and a lot of insecurity. And so we bumped it up to 65, 66 to make sure that we were appropriately capturing middle-income families, single-parent households who find themselves in middle income, and so on. And so that was really important to us. I think that the modeling on other jurisdictions and how they do rebates and so on also tells us that it's about that 60 to 65, 66. We erred on the side of a little bit more generosity, and I think that was the right thing to do given the economic situation of the province at the time.
Okay. Thank you for that. The other thing I hear from a lot of people, and certainly a view that I share, is that people don't always see the connection between the the money that's coming in through the carbon levy and direct action on climate change, be it carbon reduction, energy efficiency, investments in green technologies or innovation, what you will. They see a lot of that money going into general revenues. Would you give any thought going forward to making this plan truly revenue neutral, where there's beyond the, I recognize there has been the small business tax cut, but just simply shifting that and it not being about a revenue generation, but it truly being about, we're going to tax something we don't want, which is carbon emissions, and we're going to reduce taxes on things we do want, which is investment in business, and people allowed to keep some of their hard-earned money through reductions in personal corporate tax, personal tax. So would you consider going forward reducing personal and corporate taxes by the same amount that the carbon levy brings in to make this truly revenue neutral?
We inherited a different fiscal picture than in other places where we see economy-wide pricing. Alberta maintains, even with the implementation of the carbon levy, an $11 billion tax advantage over other jurisdictions. And that was why Dr. Leach made the recommendations that he did. Reduce the small business piece, ensure that we have rebates in place for households, and ensure that we have robust programming in other places where we can't effectively administer some kind of exemption where we have a particular pinch point in the economy, such as, for example, greenhouses or marked fuel for agricultural use. And so we undertook that because of Alberta's a significant tax advantage, and B, the number of emissions reduction opportunities that were being missed throughout the economy due to a lack of an energy efficiency strategy or a thoughtful reinvestment of the price on pollution into innovation, clean tech, renewables, those kinds of things where we know we have so much potential. And it was, in many cases, a lack of government leadership that ensured that we weren't realizing that potential. And so there were ways to economically reduce greenhouse gas emissions throughout the economy using the reinvestment of the price on pollution in a way that would reduce our GHGs faster than simply leaving this to a tax cut that in a jurisdiction that already enjoys an $11 billion tax advantage.
Thank you very much for that. So last question, again, the feedback I hear from a lot of my constituents and a lot of Albertans is the burden that the costs that are passed on to school boards and therefore schools, not-for-profits, seniors' homes, those sorts of things. While I acknowledge that those organizations can take advantage of some of the energy efficiency investments, to do so, that requires them to expend other money in areas they probably don't have the money to do, even though the cost for doing so would be somewhat lesser than it would be otherwise. It certainly does not offset the amount of money that they have lost or that they spend. So again, had you given some thought, or would you give some thought going forward to exempting categories of not-for-profits and schools in particular?
We found that a number of these things were quite difficult to enact, and that the more efficient way to do to meet some of these concerns was through energy efficiency programming. Deputy Denhoff will provide a little bit more information on costs and some historical information on costs.
So if I go at it in reverse order, on the energy efficiency side, we do have specific programs for nonprofit groups to try and reduce the costs as much as possible. So first of all, we provide direct grants to them to do a plan for their energy efficiency project. Then we provide a significant grant for them to actually implement the project. And in a number of cases, you'll see rec centers or swimming pools or whatever where they've looked at their 5-year or 10-year energy costs and saved quite a bit of money. The most interesting thing, though, is when I meet with a lot of folks, they say, our costs are going way up. And then as I get into particularly organizations, whether they're school boards or business groups, I say, okay, well, what was the 2005 to 2018, say, natural gas price or gas at the pump price? What were the average? So if you look at natural gas prices, which are an input for nonprofits on heating, and you look at 2005 to 18, they averaged 4.25 a gigajoule. If you look at 2013 to 18, they were averaging, 275 to 280. If you look at the last 12 months, including the $20 carbon tax, they're way below the 5-year average. They're way below the 10-year average. If you look at the last 12 months, including the 2018, they're still way below the 2005. So I say to the planners in some of these groups, now you must have 3 and 4 years ago planned, you do a 5-year capital budget and you do a 5-year operating budget, you don't do a 6-month one. What were the prices for gas that you were planning on? And generally they kind of look at their shoes and say, well, we're looking at $4 or we're looking at $3. And I say, well, then you're saving a fortune over what you originally thought you were going to be paying. We have record low natural gas prices, and we have very low, of course, prices at the pump, particularly relative to other jurisdictions. So I don't want to minimize it. Obviously, for a nonprofit, if they're in a building that the landlord owns and the landlord doesn't want to invest in energy efficiency, there could be an issue. But even there, we've said, look, let's talk about that and try to figure out ways we could help with a different type of energy efficiency program.
Thank you very much. And, you know, one of the challenges I find is that I come at this from a place of wanting to address this challenge. And public buy-in is really important. And so minimizing barriers to public adoption of these policies, I think, is always important. And some of the things I've talked about here today, I think, would help do that. So just so you know, that's where I'm coming from. Well, one of the questions I did want to ask on specifically is how granular is your data in terms of, I know we've got some high-level CO2 emissions data in the business plan, which I'm going to get to in a minute. But how granular is your data in terms of actual energy savings from individual line item energy efficiency initiatives? Say the amount of household or business natural gas usage we expect to curtail as a result of carbon pricing.
So as of December 31st, 17, the overall, all of the EA programs that the Energy Efficiency Alberta, the Crown Agency that we set up to do this, overall the programs that they have delivered since about a year ago, about April 2017 was when they started delivering programs, have saved Albertans $300 million in energy costs over the lifetime of those installed products. So in residential retail products, because there's different buckets of funding, 9 million energy efficient products were purchased, which represents $74 million spent. The expected energy savings are $200 million. More than $50 million was spent at more than 600 retailer locations across Alberta on energy efficient products. This is outdoor timers, appliances, smart thermostats, that kind of stuff. A total of 1,247 window insulation and tankless hot water heater contractors upgraded homes across the province. There were 150,000 households that participated in the residential no charge. There was 1 million gigajoules of energy annually saved there at a reduction of 50,000 tons of GHGs. There's also 4 million cubic meters of water that were saved through those programs. So that's 1,600 Olympic swimming pools, I am told. The business, nonprofit, and institutional programs, we've had 2,000 organizations participate in this program. So that BNI program is part of the original suite of programs aimed at nonprofits, and there is more to come. So that's 40,000 gigajoules per year of expected energy savings. The total rebates so far, $3.5 million, or an average of $2,600 per project. So that gives us an idea of scale. It's quite considerable. For that BNI program, we have expanded it and relaunched it in February. So there's $10 million of incentives now associated with that. As for the residential and commercial solar, 556 households and businesses so far. So that's 19,000 megawatt hours of new energy. So 2,700 homes powered for 1 year of energy savings so far on the residential and commercial solar. We fully expect that, in particular, those programs to expand now that we have that piece of legislation in front of the House around property assessed clean energy loans. Because again, to your point, Honourable Member, about upfront costs, that mechanism of allowing people to finance these things on their property taxes, we know removes quite a few barriers, particularly on the commercial side.
Yeah, thank you.
If you want more, Member, on GHG reductions, we can talk about that.
Sure, that's fine. I'll tell you, I'm just going to ask, we'll dive into that. So if I look at page 70 of the business plan, 1C, the total greenhouse gas emissions from source categories 276, I assume that's megatons. And when I look at the table on page 71, it says 274 for 2014. There's just a discrepancy between 276 and 274. Can you tell me is that just a rounding thing?
You know, when you're doing emissions projections, it is a somewhat inexact science until you have the measuring, reporting, and verification in place, which is why it takes a couple of years to get back the data back from Environment Canada.
Sure, although the 2014 numbers are just different by a couple there, so I just wanted to flag that and see if that in fact is just...
I can make sure that we get the appropriate number from each of those
that's fair. So I want to tie this to the recent report of the Auditor Generals of Canada, the Perspectives on Climate Change report, which is a very interesting one. One of the findings was we're not expected to meet our 2020 targets, and the 2030 targets are going to require substantial efforts. Are we, you know, I recognize that based on the table here on page 71, that Alberta's emissions will drop. But does that get us to our 2030 targets? And are we at risk of missing that? And if not, can we anticipate further changes between now and then to get there?
I want to be really clear about targets. Those are federal targets. And so the Harper government articulated a target, which was a 30% reduction off of 2005 levels by 2030. And the new federal government, elected in October of 2015, reaffirmed that target as part of what's called the nationally determined contribution. So that was Canada's NDC at the Paris negotiations. It's not Alberta's target, it's the federal target. Our position on targets all along as a province has been that we are an energy producer and we will do our part. If there is a scaled up level of ambition that is desired by the federal government, then they are going to have to make the appropriate investments to make that real. But barring significant action from competitor jurisdictions for our energy intensive trade exposed competitors, that we have set the level of ambition according to what we believe that our economy can do, and to also turn the page on Alberta's previous position of climate inaction and the reputational risks that both our energy sector and others suffered because of that. You know, the fact is that Alberta is an energy producer, and so we are forecasting essentially what amounts to a peak and then a decline through energy efficiency investments, the phase-in of renewables, and the investment in innovation. Those investments reflect the level of ambition and a level of practical decision-making that we believe that we can undertake. What we did not do, and we were very, very clear about this, was articulate a target that we had no intention of keeping. We saw that in previous governments, both federal and provincial, and I was not interested in an exercise that wasn't real. We took the position that rather than talking about targets, we would just undertake action. And that's what we have done. And we have, through the forecasting now, we are estimated to reduce our annual GHGs by between 16 and 18 megatons in 2020 relative to our projected without CLP implementation. And beyond that, to 2030, where you have coal-fired electricity pollution being zero, you have our methane emissions down, and so on. We may even get to something in the 22 megaton neighborhood, depending on our investments in innovation in the oil sands.
Okay, so just so I'm really clear, you have no intention of setting any specific Alberta-specific targets?
Not at this time. Okay. Targets are an international conversation, and they are set by the federal government. From our perspective, as long as we are actually accomplishing the action of reducing greenhouse gas emissions, I'm far more interested in focusing on that.
So based on this table we've got on page 71 of the business plan, would you say that Alberta's carbon emissions have peaked? If I look at the last line there, 2017 policy and economic expectations with climate leadership plan, plus potential reductions from innovation, that tells me that 2014 was our peak year and that we will go down by roughly 50 megatons between now and 2030. Is that the likely trajectory? Is it safe to say that Alberta's carbon emissions have peaked?
I'm not sure. It really depends on a number of different economic factors, and again, because we are energy producers. And so, according to this, what we've got is in and around 2020, we have a peak, but it really depends on a number of different factors in terms of oil sands production and other. And of course the innovation investments in lowering the carbon in the barrel. That's certainly the intent. But we do know that we provided for growth in oil sands emissions up to 100 megatons from the current 67.
Thank you, Minister. And that brings us to the end of that round. And we